I don't know if you've noticed it or not, but there are a lot of people who think that the best way to lead is to stay out of the way. In fact, we heard our former president say we should lead from behind. I'm not sure what that means, lead from behind. I do know that, as my mentor John Maxwell says, leadership is influence, nothing more and nothing less. And sometimes that means I don't have to be the superstar on the front of the stage. So if you mean lead from behind the stage, meaning somebody else being the spotlight, I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I do wonder what you mean by lead from behind. Does that mean that you simply comply without question? Does that mean that you have nothing to say with those things that might be questionable? Or does it mean that you stay out of the way and let everything else happen because you're really not a leader? Because I don't think that's what great leadership does. That's what I want to talk about in this episode of Leading Leaders. There was a time when I was in the Air Force, and I've probably talked about this story here before, but it's pretty important for where we are today. I was at my first duty assignment, training assignment, and I'd been sent to Chanute Air Force Base, Illinois. And while there, I was in training as a firefighter. And of course, part of that requires classroom time to learn about the sciences of fire. Now, one thing I can tell you is that it has been true all of my life. You can go back and ask my high school teachers, my English teacher, my science teacher, my math teacher. Used to get really upset because I think a lot visually, which means sometimes when the thinking is pretty deep, I will literally close my eyes while I'm thinking because I'm seeing things and the visual around me is distracting. So I focus sometimes with my eyes closed. Some people will think that I'm asleep while I'm reading because I will read, and then while I process that information, I'll close my eyes to do so. This particular day in fire science class, we were being taught about the power of this firefighting agent, known then as Halon 1301 and Halon 1311 as its derivative. Now, this was back in the early 90s. I went through basic training in 88. I went into the Fire Academy in 89. And in that season, late 80s, early 90s, there was very little known about halon. In fact, halon now has been, I won't say outlawed, but very, very close in a lot of places because of its impacts on the ozone. And so it's not used as widely as it was then. But here's what we knew then. Very little. In fact, one of the things we were being taught as a matter of class that day was about a little tool called the fire tetrahedron. And the whole reason for the fire tetrahedron was we all learned in physical science in high school about the fire triangle, the three sides of the fire triangle: heat, fuel, and oxygen. Well, heat, fuel, and oxygen is what it takes to make a fire. So if you can remove any one of those three, the heat, which would be what the flames create, or the fuel, which would be the substance that's burning, whether it's the couch or a piece of paper or a house, or you can remove the oxygen, i.e., if you've ever seen a grease fire on your stove, you either throw flour on it or you put a lid on it. You don't put water in it, that scatters the grease, but if you put a lid on it, you starve it of oxygen and it dies. The fire tetrahedron, though, said we now have this substance, halon, which will extinguish a fire, and we're not sure why. Because we do know that when you put it in the room, the temperature doesn't change much. We also know that we haven't literally removed the fuel because the substance that was burning is actually still there. We haven't removed the oxygen because you can still breathe in the room. So it's really, really bizarre. In fact, they began to use it in a lot of systems like the vent-a-hoods over the top of the stove in the restaurant or in a computer room because it doesn't leave much residue at all. So if a cooling tower full of servers and computers get really, really hot, if there was a fire in there, you don't want to fill that with water. You destroy everything that's not burning. You don't want to fill it with something where you can't breathe because there's people in the room. But halon in reasonable doses will put out a fire that seems many times its size, and they couldn't tell you why. In fact, Our instructor said straight up, he said, look, we don't know exactly how it works, but here's our theory for the fire tetrahedron. It's not just the heat, the fuel, and the oxygen, but a thing called the chemical chain reaction. Now, I'm going to be honest and tell you, it's been 25 years, more than 25 years, since I went through fire sciences school. I'm sure that today, with all of the technology and science that we have and all the teaching that's been done around this, people like my friend Mick Moffitt can probably tell you a whole lot more about halon, how it worked, why it worked, and what it does now if they even still use it. That's not my point. What I want to point out to you is that the fire tetrahedron was a scientific reference point created to validate the unknown. A scientific reference point created to validate the unknown. They simply couldn't tell you how or why halon worked, just that it produced the results they wanted, and they couldn't put their finger on it. Now, a particular day in question, I was in class. I'm listening to this professor teach this. Now, he's a guest professor, and he's being evaluated on his quality of professing, of his being an instructor in the scientific realm of the U.S. Air Force. And as he's delivering this class, he outranks me significantly. Obviously, I'm an airman basic. I had months in the service. But I'm listening to him teach. I've got my eyes closed. I'm thinking deeply about what he says. And he gets irritated with the fact that I'm not staring him down with rapt attention to what he's saying. And so he calls on me. And he yells at me thinking that I'm sleeping. And he says, since you seem to know this enough to sleep in my class, why don't you get up here and explain it? So I went to the board and I began to write on the board that I felt like the reason that the particular process worked, the fire tetrahedron, was because halon was a bonding agent. Now, let me remind you, the words that came out of the mouth of the professor less than 20 minutes before is, we don't know why it works. This is our theory to explain the fact that it does work, and we can't really put our finger on it yet. And so I said, well, what you've told us is that as this burning process happens, it's not really the paper or the wood that burns, it's the fumes escaping off of it, which means those fumes have a particular burning point, a balance at which the exact right temperature, the exact right number of particles of that fume, and the exact amount of heat come together, and the oxygen binds to the particle, and poof, you have flame. And that's why there are places where you can have enough heat in a room with no visible flame at all, and certain things will burst into flame, because as the fumes come off of them from being heated to a certain temperature, that fume at a certain temperature becomes flammable. What if halon is a bonding agent, and it looks for that particle of oxygen, and it looks for that particle of fume, and in a place that we can't visually see with our eyeballs, it bonds together with one of those, so it's no longer H2O with certain numbers of hydrogen parts and certain numbers of oxygen parts, therefore becoming water. It's now a non-burnable compound. And he chewed me up one side and down the other. And he said, look, obviously you don't have any idea what you're talking about. You're just standing up here making stuff up because I called you out because you're embarrassed. And I said, no, you asked for why it worked, and that's my theory as to why it works. That did not go over well with leadership. He chewed me out and sent me back to my seat. Unfortunately for him, it turns out that the guy who was evaluating his ability to deliver as a firefighting instructor for the U.S. Air Force also happened to have some background in physics and chemistry. And he stood up and he said, don't erase that just yet. Let me think on that for a minute, because there's a possibility that his theory is right. Think a moment what that means for our society today. See, one of the things we're being told left and right, backward and forward, up and down, and right down the middle of the lane is, if you have an idea that doesn't jive with the ideas that have already been put out there, shut up. You're being told that leadership means you do what you're told, comply, listen, and keep silent. That has never been the case in strong leadership. It's never been the case in great leadership. In fact, it's always been great leadership that rises sometimes from the back, sometimes from the middle, and sometimes from the wings, where great leaders will come up with an idea that nobody has had before, or an explanation that nobody else has been able to put their finger on just yet. If you think I'm crazy, ask yourself, where did Elon Musk come from? Now, Bill Gates' family has been around for years. Generations of the Gateses have had huge impact in politics and society, in money, and in the way that money moves. But there are a whole lot of innovations that have come about under Gates' tutelage. And he is a researcher. He's an intelligent guy, a guy who does his homework. So let me ask you this. If leaders like Gates or Jobs or Musk or Tesla had remained silent, if they only could speak out about the conventional wisdom that had already been discussed, approved, and proven, where would we be? What about Salk? If he had never created the polio vaccine, do you think he did that because someone told him, here's the right way, follow the path, only do what you're told? No, he was a rule breaker. He had new ideas of his own. He created what had never been brought to light in human life before. Now, I believe today we're in a place where we are in desperate need of leaders who will speak up in a way that may not fit the conventional wisdom, may not be approved by current authority. There's a big difference between being rebellious for the sake of being rebellious, i.e., I refuse to submit to authority because, well, I just don't like to submit to authority. There's a difference between that attitude and the attitude that says, I'm going to go outside the box. I'm going to try something new. I'm going to share an idea that perhaps no one has shared before. I'm going to bring to the table something that no one has ever pondered before, even if all I have right now is a hypothesis. At least I've taken some time to think about it. Even if the best I can do is throw my ideas at you and wait for you to pound on them a little bit and hand them back so we can make them better. John Maxwell says in the world of thinking, that's called taking your idea for a walk. Just like you take your dog out on a walk and let the neighbors peer at your dog and go, that's a beautiful dog, or that's a hideous dog, or are you sure that's a dog? It's the ideas that we put out in front of others where our brainstorm in a collective can be pounded on until it becomes a great idea. But to hold that idea in the back of your mind, to write it down in your journal and share it with nobody, well, that's not great leadership. That's hoarding of ideas. And I don't think there's ever been a time in society that was a good plan. We know from looking back at Einstein's journals and writings, from Edison's journals and writings, from Da Vinci's journals and writings, there were a whole lot of great ideas that went through their heads. Some that were way ahead of their time. Even Tesla had inventions that today we haven't figured out how to make them work, but they worked on paper. And then we also have some that Tesla made work, and the leaders of industry said, oh, we can't make money if you do it like that. Let me remind you, there is a cartel. They call themselves a cartel, who control the number of hours that a light bulb can work. There's also one light bulb right now burning right around 100 years. They've proven you can make a light bulb work that long, but it wasn't conducive to consumerism and making a lot of money. They thought if all of our light bulbs last that long, how will we ever sell a new one? Good point. So we created light bulbs that don't last as long as they should. Try to replace the headlights in a new SUV. Saw a gentleman the other day that bought one headlight over $200. I was standing at the parts store when he ordered it. And I told him I'd heard that there were people with these newer SUVs with the LED rings around the back of their truck that cost $700 for a tail light. $100. I used to replace headlight bulbs when I worked at gas stations as a kid. It was $7 with the labor and the light bulb involved for both of them, $7. Now it's almost $200 for a headlight. This is craziness, but it's consumerism, it's capitalism, it's how the world goes. The question is, are you silent because someone told you shh, or are you silent because you have no ideas? Great leadership doesn't work well with either one of those. If you've got ideas, especially ideas that will make the world better, especially brainstorm ideas that nobody else has thought of, or at least not tried to put in practice yet, go for it. You probably heard, and if you've read my book, as I walk out of frame. If you've read my book, Live a More Excellent Life, there's a whole story in there about when I gave up on my dream because I walked out of the science fair after winning first place overall and first place in physics in high school. I walked away from science altogether because I had a news reporter say to me, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. If you actually pull it off, you will rewrite the considerations of the Newtonian law of perpetual motion." And I said, "I'm okay with that." And he laughed at me and said, "But it'll never happen." And he walked away. And I took my science project and I threw it in the trash, and it has never seen the light of day since then. Don't let idiots silence you from success. Don't let people stand in the way of your ideas just because they don't agree with them and they don't believe them, or they look at you and say, "Well, who are you to say?" They thought I was the guy sleeping in class. They thought I was the guy who didn't get it. They thought I was the guy who didn't care. After the professor was corrected by his instructor to say, he might be onto something here. As the professor went to take his seat, our regular instructor stood up and he said, "Well, I've never called on him, but I have noticed that Norris has really heavy eyelids. I always thought he was sleeping, but obviously not." As a leader, I want to challenge you, even when they think you're sleeping, even when they think there's something wrong with you, even when they think you're not paying attention, pay attention. And at the right time, be ready to speak up. We'd hate to see that, like Da Vinci and Tesla and so many other brilliant minds, the best thoughts you ever had were found in a journal long after your passing. I'm J Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast for Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day.